So color contrast is one of the most fundamental parts of accessibility because it directly affects how clearly users can perceive text and interface elements. Strong contrast especially supports people with low vision. When text blends into the background, it becomes a barrier, particularly for users who rely on clarity and sharpness to distinguish shapes and letters. Contrast also plays a major role for people with different types of color blindness. Many users can't differentiate between certain hues, so relying on color alone or using colors that are too similar create barriers. Good contrast ensures that information remains visible and understandable no matter how someone perceives color. Even fully sighted users benefit when text and visuals stand out clearly. Think about trying to read your phone in bright sunlight or scanning something quickly in a dim room. High contrast makes information easier to see, faster to understand, and reduces cognitive effort for everyone. WCAG also reinforces this importance by requiring that all meaningful text, symbols, and interactive components meet a certain contrast ratio. This doesn't just apply to static elements, it also includes different states like hover, focus, selected, and active states. So each state must maintain enough contrast so users can perceive what's happening as they navigate. So just a quick refresher on WCAG contrast requirements. For normal text, the minimum contrast ratio is 4.5 to 1 against the background. This applies to most body text, placeholder text, and labels. For large text, the requirement is a bit lower at 3 to 1 against the background. Large text is defined as 18 points or 24 pixels or more. And if the hover focus state changes the text color, such as for links, the text must retain a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. For non-text elements, they also have contrast requirements. Any visual cue that helps someone identify a UI component, like input borders, button outlines, or icons, must reach a contrast ratio of at least 3 to 1 against the background. For graphics, anything needed to understand the meaning, like chart lines or infographic elements, also needs a 3 to 1 contrast ratio. And for states like hover, focus, and selected, they must also reach a 3 to 1 contrast ratio so users can clearly see when something is interactive or active. So when we talk about creating good color contrast, the first strategy is to pick colors that have enough brightness difference. A good contrast combination is simply one bright color placed next to a dark color. That strong difference in lightness is what makes text or icons stand out clearly. A bad contrast example is when you pair two colors that are similarly bright. Even if they're different hues, like red versus blue or green versus blue, if the brightness levels are too close, they'll still blend together and be hard to read. So it helps to think of contrast like a brightness scale rather than just a color wheel. Most people focus on hue, like choosing red instead of blue, but that doesn't automatically improve accessibility. What really matters is the lightness versus darkness of the colors. It's also important to never guess. Even experienced designers can be surprised by the actual contrast ratio. Always use tools to check contrast to make sure your combinations meet the appropriate contrast minimums. When it comes to brand colors, a lot of teams worry that accessibility means they'll have to completely redesign their visual identity. The good news is you usually don't need to change your brand at all. Most of the time, small brightness adjustments are all it takes to make brand colors accessible. Lightening a color slightly or darkening it just a little bit can create the contrast needed without losing the look or feel of the brand. Another option is to add lighter or darker variations of your existing brand colors. That gives you an accessible palette to use for text, buttons, and important UI elements, while still keeping your original colors for decorative or larger design elements. Accessibility doesn't mean changing who you are as a brand, it just means adapting your colors so everyone can clearly see and use your content. So just to talk about one of the most common places where contrast fails is when text is placed on top of images, gradients, or transparent cards. These backgrounds are tricky because the brightness changes from one part of the image to another. That means the text might look readable in one spot, but completely disappear in another. You've probably seen this on websites where white text is placed directly on a photo, and depending on the part of the image, it becomes almost impossible to read. The simple rule here is don't place text directly on busy images. If the background has a lot of detail, movement, or variation in brightness, the text will always struggle. Instead, use a solid background behind the text or even a semi-opaque card, something like a black or white box at 70 or 80% opacity. This gives the text a stable surface to sit on and keeps it readable no matter what's behind it. The key idea here is to keep it simple. Fancy effects like transparent cards, blurred layers, or gradients can look modern, but if they reduce readability, they harm accessibility and user experience. So when in doubt, just give the text a clean, consistent background so everyone can read it comfortably. Another important principle in visual accessibility is that color should never be the only way we communicate information. When information relies on color alone, like only using red to show an error in a form, it creates barriers for users with color vision deficiencies, blindness, or low vision. The fix is simple though. We want to use color as a helpful signal, but always pair it with something else, like text, an icon, or a clear description of what needs to be corrected. The same idea applies to charts, graphs, and dashboards, which are some of the most common places accessibility fails. More often than not, color is used to differentiate data. So for example, three lines in a line chart that look different only because they're red, green, and blue. But for some users, those colors can nearly look identical. So instead of relying solely on color, we want to add a second visual cue. So for example, you want to use different line styles. So whether that's solid, dashed, or dotted, you can use different shapes for markers, so circles, triangles, or squares. And you can use labels on or near the data so people don't have to guess what each color means. And just as important, we want to make sure that lines, bars, and markers are high contrast. Thin, low contrast lines can disappear, especially in dark mode or on smaller screens. A slightly thicker line or higher contrast color makes the chart much easier to understand. So on the slide here, you can see we have a screenshot that was taken from our Ramp platform of a line graph showing a trend of issues. This graph utilizes different shapes in addition to color to distinguish the different severity levels. So you can see that the critical severity level is represented by the square shape in addition to the color red. When designing for contrast, we also have to look beyond dark mode to ensure that readability is available across all viewing settings. Users switch between light mode, dark mode, and even high contrast mode, depending on their needs and preferences. On top of that, device settings like brightness, night shift, or blue light filters can dramatically change how colors appear. One of the biggest misconceptions is that dark mode automatically solves accessibility. It does not. A color combination that looks perfect in light mode can become completely unreadable in dark mode, and the same is true in reverse. That's why it's so important to test your designs in both modes whenever possible. Check how your colors behave when the background flips, and make sure text, icons, and key elements stay clear and distinguishable across all environments. As helpful as AI design tools are, they don't always get accessibility right. AI is great at generating visually appealing designs, but it's not naturally contrast aware. A lot of the color choices it produces look pretty, but they often fail accessibility requirements. For example, AI tools commonly generate low contrast palettes, colors that look soft or trendy but blend into each other. You also see things like light gray text on a white background, which creates visual barriers for many users. Another common issue is thin outlines. AI tends to prioritize aesthetics, so it might use very subtle borders. Soft colors in dark mode are another problem. AI might choose pastel or muted tones that don't stand out against a dark background, again, creating readability issues. So the key takeaway here is AI isn't contrast aware unless we tell it to be. It won't automatically aim for WCAG contrast ratios unless you explicitly guide it or manually check the output. So always verify AI generated colors using a contrast checker. We have our own color contrast checker tool, so we recommend using that to confirm that your colors meet WCAG requirements. One thing a lot of teams don't realize is that Google rewards accessibility. Google's entire search algorithm is built around one core principle, showing people's pages they can actually read and use. So when a page has good contrast, it becomes easier to read, easier to scan, and easier to navigate. Better readability creates stronger SEO signals, things like longer time on a page, better engagement, and lower bounce rates. If visitors open a page and the text is hard to see and difficult to read, users might back out of the page, and Google sees that as a bad experience. So accessibility and SEO are deeply connected. Good UX becomes good SEO when your site is accessible, when your colors meet contrast requirements, and your contrast is readable. Google views your page as a higher quality and more user-friendly site. So how can we help? Our guided audit tools can identify and outline the color contrast of elements that fail to reach the contrast requirements. If a page contains various colors for text contrast or non-text contrast related content, it may be beneficial to explore consulting services and accessibility audits. Additionally, we also provide VPATs to document whether all contrast-related content on your site complies with accessibility standards. So thank you all for taking the time to join us for this webinar. And if you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to share them.